What if she never loved you? Not the way you understood love, not the way you offered it, raw, trembling, full of surrender. What if every soft smile, every breathless embrace, every whispered promise was not intimacy but strategy? You weren't her partner. You were her proof. Proof that she could be worshipped, that someone would bleed to be near her, that she could cause ruin with a glance and call it romance. But you didn't see it then, because you were starving for touch, for recognition, for meaning. And when the will is famished, it mistakes poison for nourishment. She fed you just enough to keep you begging. Not enough to make you full. You called it love, she called it control. This is not cynicism. It is metaphysical fact. The will does not seek harmony. It seeks subjugation. The moment you bent to her power, the moment your soul asked, "What more can I give?" you ceased being a man and became a tool, a reflection, a stage for her ascension. If you've ever felt the ache of being discarded by someone you loved, comment, "I saw it too late." And you did. Too late to stop yourself from collapsing. Too late to pull your dignity from her grasp. Too late to unfeel the high of being momentarily chosen. Because that's what she gave you. Choice, not companionship. You were not met. You were selected, and only as long as you confirmed her worth. The moment you questioned, the moment you asked for truth, the moment you reached for her without performance, she disappeared. Not because she was confused, but because the illusion had ended. You believed you could earn her love by becoming smaller, softer, more agreeable. But love that must be earned is not love. It is labor. And she employed you to labor for her ego. Did she even know? Perhaps not. The will uses us long before we're aware of being used. But unconscious manipulation is still manipulation. You suffered because you believed the performance. And now you suffer because you can't forget it. But what if the suffering isn't about her? What if the real grief is about how easily you abandoned yourself? She didn't steal your soul. You offered it. You turned down your voice. You shrank your needs. You learned to speak in silences. And each time you did, she smiled. Not because she saw you, but because you disappeared a little more. This is what power worships. Not presence, but erasure. She didn't want to hold you. She wanted to own the feeling of being held. She didn't want to love you. She wanted to feel adored. You were the vessel. She was the altar. And you knelt, not because you're weak, but because you were trained by childhood, by longing, by a world that sells love as suffering, to believe that devotion is enough. But devotion to the unseeing is self-destruction. And now all you're left with is a memory you can't trust. Some days you swear she cared. Other days you remember the emptiness in her eyes. The way she turned cold the moment you needed her. The way she punished your honesty with silence. You call it confusion. It is not. It is the result of love being used as leverage. What you felt was real. What she returned was rehearsal. She rehearsed need, rehearsed vulnerability, rehearsed connection, but always with an eye on the exit, because she knew, subconsciously or not, that once you were completely hers, she would lose interest, because there is no thrill in owning what no longer resists. So she reintroduced tension. She pulled away. She punished your closeness. And like an addict, you begged for another taste. You didn't want her love. You wanted the version of yourself that felt alive when she gave it. And now that it's gone, you think you lost her. But no, you lost the illusion, the idea, the high. She remains unchanged. It is you who has shifted, but the will is clever. It whispers, try again, chase again. Someone else will fill the void. Don't listen. The void is not hers, it's yours, and it's been there long before she arrived. Now begins the return. Return not to her, but to the version of yourself that never needed to be chosen to feel worthy. The self that did not kneel, did not perform, did not chase ghosts in human skin. Let this loss be the altar on which you burn the need to be loved through suffering. Let it be your awakening. She loved the power, not the man. And the man must now rise, not for revenge, not for her attention, but for silence. Stillness is your rebellion. because in stillness the will cannot act. And only in the absence of action does truth emerge. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were simply too awake for someone who needed you asleep. So sleep no more, see clearly, and walk away. She didn't break your heart. She exposed it. You gave her access to the most tender parts of you, your longing, your loyalty, your ache to be enough. And she walked through it like a conqueror walks through a burning village, not in awe, not in gratitude, but with the cold entitlement of someone who believes the fire is theirs to command. And why shouldn't she? You handed her the match. Every unanswered message, every apology you whispered for simply having needs. Every moment you waited for her to choose you while pretending you didn't care, these were not acts of love. They were rituals of worship, and she watched, and she knew, and she took. Because she could. The will is not gentle, it does not cradle, it devours, and in her the will found an efficient host. One who learned that to be desired is to be powerful, and to be powerful is to be untouchable. So she danced in your longing, knowing you would mistake her presence for intimacy. She gave you just enough attention to keep you hoping. Just enough silence to keep you desperate. Just enough chaos to keep you spinning, and it was not accidental, it was instinct. She fed off your confusion, not because she hated you, but because she loved what you gave her. The high of being needed, the rush of being irreplaceable, the illusion of being the source of someone else's suffering. You think she had the power, but it was never hers, it was yours. You just didn't know how to hold it, so you gave it away. And now, in the wake of it all, you ask, was it ever real? The answer is brutal. Yes, it was real, for you. You truly cared. You truly saw her. You truly wanted to build something that could last beyond the performance. But love, in the hands of the power-hungry, becomes theater. And every time you cried, every time you confessed, every time you bared your soul, she took a bow. You weren't a partner. You were the stage, and you weren't heard. You were watched. And now that the curtains have closed, you stand in the wreckage wondering why it hurts so much. It hurts because you're mourning something deeper than her. You're mourning the part of yourself that still believed love could redeem abandonment. That if you just loved well enough, you could make someone stay, but you can't. No amount of goodness can anchor someone who doesn't want to be held. No amount of devotion can reach a soul that uses love as leverage. She didn't want to be understood, she wanted to be obeyed. And now you understand. This is not where your story ends. This is where the performance dies and the self begins. You are not here to be consumed. You are not a sermon to be preached only when it flatters her ego. You are not a mirror, a ladder, a stage. You are the man, and you are waking up. She loved the power, not the man. Let that truth burn every illusion you once built in her honor. Let it raise the memory of soft hands that held only for control. Let it kill the voice that still asks what you could have done differently. You could have walked away sooner, that's all. And now you will, and not with vengeance, not with rage, but with silence. The kind of silence that comes from a man who no longer needs to be chosen to feel real. Because you were always real. She just wasn't looking, she was feeding. And now she's hungry again for someone else's fire. Let her starve. Let yourself heal. Not by forgetting, but by remembering who you were before her approval defined your worth. The will comes in many faces. Some smile, some seduce. Some promise love but deliver only dependence. You've seen one now. And if you remain awake, you won't need to see another. It wasn't love. It was a contract. Unsigned, unspoken, and wholly one-sided. She brought you close only to prove she could push you away. The tighter you held on, the more she disappeared. And you called it mystery. You called it depth. You wrote poetry in the margins of her indifference, trying to turn a mirror into a window. But she was never looking out. She was looking in. She watched herself through your hunger, measured her power in the way your hands trembled, felt divine when you broke down. Because gods do not love, they demand worship. And you gave it. Not because you're naive, but because you believed love could be given enough to become mutual. You believed wrongly that if you poured enough into her emptiness, it would overflow back into you. But her cup had no bottom. She didn't want to grow. She wanted to be adored in her stagnation. She wanted the benefits of your evolution without the burden of her own. And when you asked for reciprocity, she heard criticism. When you asked for presence, she heard accusation. When you needed her, she heard inconvenience. Because her power was rooted in your silence. Every time you swallowed your truth to avoid another withdrawal, she became stronger. Every time you made excuses for her neglect, the contract grew heavier. You carried it, day after day, and called it commitment. But commitment without return is not loyalty. It's bondage. She didn't bind you. You bound yourself with the rope of your own expectations, and when it frayed, when it cut into your skin, when the wounds became too deep to hide, you still blamed yourself for bleeding. That's what the will does. It turns its victims against themselves, because if you see her clearly, the game ends. So let it end. Let the story collapse, let the pedestal crumble. Let her fall from the throne you built with your unacknowledged pain. And in the quiet that follows, don't rush to rebuild. Sit in the wreckage. Look around. What you called love was never mutual. What you called intimacy was performance. What you called compatibility was convenience. She was not your partner, she was your projection. And now that the illusion is gone, you can finally grieve what was real. Your effort, your sincerity, and your hope. These were not wasted, they were misplaced. But from misplacement comes wisdom. And from wisdom comes stillness. And in stillness you will begin again. Not to chase, not to fix, not to prove you are worthy of love, but to remember that you are no longer a man who sets himself on fire to keep another warm. You are not the echo of her absence. You are the voice that will never beg again. Because you have finally heard yourself. She loved the power, not the man. And now, the man has returned to himself. You kept thinking if you just did one more thing, if you just gave a little more, she'd finally see you. But how do you make someone see what they are determined to use? The will doesn't look at its tools, it uses them. And when they wear down, it replaces them. You weren't seen, you were functional. Your empathy, useful. Your patience, exploitable. Your silence, perfect. She didn't need you whole. She needed you compliant. So you learned to disappear while smiling, to agree when your heart was screaming, to give even when you were empty. And you called it love, because the alternative was too painful, to admit you were being fed scraps and calling it a feast. But the soul always knows, and eventually it revolts. That's why you broke down. Not because you're weak, but because something in you finally refused to be starved. You began to speak, to question, to ask for consistency, and she recoiled, because power cannot survive in the presence of boundaries. She called you difficult, needy, dramatic. But what you were becoming was awake. And the moment you awaken, the illusion begins to collapse. Not just the illusion of her, but the deeper one. The idea that love must be earned through suffering. Who taught you that? Whose absence are you still trying to fix by loving the unavailable? This isn't just about her. She was a vessel, a catalyst, a mirror. She reflected back every part of you that still believed you were only as valuable as your usefulness. And now you see it. You see how often you apologized for your needs, how often you minimized your truth, how many times you said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. You see how often you chased the very thing that hurt you, believing pain meant purpose. That was the lie. And now you are done lying. No more shrinking. No more waiting for the bare minimum and calling it destiny. No more loving those who thrive on your silence. You are not here to be palatable. You are not here to decorate someone else's self-image. You are not here to prove your worth through your wounds. You are here to return to yourself, to sit with the ache, to honor the loss, and to rise, not in spite of it, but because of it. She loved the power, not the man, but the man is no longer performing. He is present, and in presence there is no more hunger. Only truth. Do you know why it still haunts you? Because a part of you still wonders if she was right to leave. Not because she offered reasons, but because you offered excuses. You tried so hard to justify her coldness, her distance, her sudden cruelty. You made yourself the villain in a story written to protect her illusion. But the truth is, she didn't leave because you failed. She left because you saw through her. And nothing terrifies the will more than being seen without control. She wasn't afraid of losing you. She was afraid of losing the power she held over your perception. You stopped chasing. You started asking questions. You stopped accepting crumbs. That was the beginning of your exile. She didn't want to meet you at your depth. She wanted to swim in the shallow end and call it intimacy. The moment you asked for something real, something mutual, she vanished. And now here you are, surrounded by the echoes of promises she never kept, haunted by the warmth she used as bait. But here is what you must understand. You were never hard to love. You were just impossible to control once you saw your own worth. And she couldn't love what she couldn't command. So she rewrote the narrative, made herself the victim, painted your clarity as cruelty, turned your boundaries into betrayal. Because in the absence of truth, the will invents justification. Let her invent. Let her story unfold without your participation. Because the man you are now does not argue with illusions. He sees, he knows, he walks. She loved the power, not the man. But the man, once bound by longing, now walks in silence. He owes no explanation. He carries no hope of return. He carries only truth. And the truth is enough. She didn't leave because you changed. She left because you stopped changing, for her. As long as you twisted yourself into the shape of her preferences, she stayed. As long as you apologized first, yielded first, forgave first, she smiled. Because your suffering kept her centered. But the moment you began to return to yourself, to speak without fear, to feel without asking permission, she saw something she couldn't tolerate. Equality. The will does not love equals, it loves leverage, and you had forfeited yours long ago. You gave her the upper hand thinking she'd use it to protect you. But she used it to measure how far you could fall. And when you finally refused to fall again, she left. You didn't lose her. You released her. The version of you who loved her, that wasn't you. That was your wound dressed up as a savior. That was your abandonment playing hero. That was your inner child still believing that enough sacrifice would make someone stay. But no one stays out of guilt, not for long. They stay for power, or they stay for love. And once your love stopped making her feel powerful, she had no reason to stay. It's cruel, but it's honest. And honesty is your only salvation now. You don't need another apology, another explanation, another breadcrumb of closure. You need only this truth. She loved what you gave her, not who you were, not what you carried, not the man beneath the offering. She loved the pedestal, not the person. She loved your ache, not your soul. And now she's gone. Good. Let her go so deeply that even the echoes of her voice no longer reach you. You were never hers. You were a moment, a mirror, a meal. But you are no longer starving. You have stopped asking to be seen by those who only see what they can extract. You have stopped mistaking control for intimacy. You have stopped calling it love when it feels like erasure. And in that stopping, you begin. She loved the power, not the man. But the man now walks with empty hands and an unshaken soul. There's a silence you begin to crave once the noise is gone. The noise of proving, of justifying, of begging for presence and calling it conversation. The noise of performing worth for someone who only loved you when you were pretending. You thought love was loud, urgent, dramatic, chaotic. But that was her kind of love, the kind that keeps you confused enough to stay. Real love is quiet, and she was never still enough to give it. She couldn't sit in the same room as your truth without needing to control it. She couldn't let you hurt without making it about her. She couldn't let you speak without deciding what you meant. It wasn't that she couldn't love, it's that she couldn't let go of power long enough to try. And you? You kept hoping power and love could coexist, that her dominance could one day become protection, that her games could become care, that her coldness was temporary. But it was the default, because someone who thrives on power cannot be intimate, Intimacy requires equality, presence, vulnerability. She had none of these to offer. And yet, you stayed, not because of love, but because of fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being alone, fear that if you walked away, you would confirm what you always feared, that you were unworthy all along. But now you see it clearly. She didn't leave because you were unworthy. She left because she couldn't manipulate a man who had nothing left to prove. Your worth was never the issue, her control was. She loved the version of you who apologized for existing. She loved the man who didn't ask questions. She loved the hunger in your voice when she gave you the slightest attention. But you don't speak that way anymore. You speak from within, not upward. And you don't chase, you observe, and you don't justify, you walk. She loved the power, not the man. But the man outgrew the game, and that is why she left. Not because you were too much, but because you finally became too real. You learned to confuse love with labor. Not because you were foolish, but because no one ever taught you that love doesn't need to be earned. So you worked, tirelessly. You carried both your weight and hers. You explained, forgave, accommodated, waited. You became the bridge, the balm, the apology, and she let you. Because the more you gave, the less she had to offer. The more you worked, the less she had to show up. And she convinced you, subtly, slowly, that this was balance. But love is not a transaction, and it is never sustainable when only one person pays. You kept thinking the next gesture would prove your value, that the next sacrifice would be enough. But there is no enough for the will. It consumes endlessly. It needs contrast to feel alive, and your suffering was her proof that she mattered, not to you, to herself. She didn't need your love. She needed your depletion. She needed to see you crawl back again and again to confirm that she could still summon you, that she still had power, that her absence still ruled your nervous system. It was never about closeness, it was about control. But you stayed, because you loved who you were when she approved of you. And that is the deepest ache. Not losing her, but losing access to the version of yourself that felt lovable when she smiled. Now the smile is gone, and all that's left is silence, the kind that used to terrify you, the kind that once screamed, "You've failed." But now that silence is becoming sacred, and because it no longer marks your rejection, it marks your return. You no longer need her to choose you. You no longer need to be fed from a hand that holds you hostage. You are learning to feed yourself, and the hunger fades. She loved the power, not the man. But the man no longer starves for approval. He sits at his own table and does not beg. There is a specific kind of grief that follows awakening. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of recognition. The moment you realize it was never what you thought, that the love you protected, nurtured, and defended was never really there. You weren't held, you were handled. There's a difference. Being held means being witnessed in your whole form, ugly, radiant, trembling, loud. It means being accepted in contradiction. She never held you. She curated you, managed you, molded you into something easier to admire from a distance. And in return, you shrunk yourself. You rounded your edges. You offered only the pieces of you that she had previously praised. That's not love. That's performance. And the performance exhausted you. Not all at once. Slowly. Fatally. You began to vanish inside the script. You forgot your original voice. You forgot how it felt to speak without checking her expression. You forgot how to need without guilt. But now, in the aftermath, the silence is revealing. You remember what it means to hear your own thoughts without fear of interruption. You remember what it means to sit in stillness and feel presence instead of panic. And you begin to forgive yourself, not for staying, but for not knowing. You didn't know that real love doesn't require contortion. You didn't know that your needs weren't excessive. You didn't know that your gentleness wasn't a defect. You know now. And that knowing is costing you the illusion, the fantasy, the hope that maybe one day she'd see you. She saw you, and she chose not to meet you there, but that was not your failure. That was her limit. And now you rise beyond it. She loved the power, not the man, but the man is done mistaking attention for affection. and performance for partnership. You thought the silence meant something had changed, that she was thinking, reflecting, coming to understand the harm she caused. But silence, in the hands of power, is not contemplation. It's control. Her silence wasn't an accident, it was a lever, a calculated withdrawal designed to train you. The longer she withheld, the more desperate you became. The more desperate you became, the easier you were to bend. This is the cruelty of psychological power. It turns your longing against you. You began to chase, not for joy, but for relief. You began to speak, not to connect, but to be heard. You began to give, not from abundance, but from fear. That's not love. That's coercion in slow motion. And yet, you stayed. You justified. You called it a rough patch. You blamed your past. You thought if you just did one more thing, she'd return to softness. But the softness was never real. It was bait. She needed you to believe in a version of her that only existed in short bursts, enough to make you question yourself when it disappeared. That confusion was the point. A man who questions his perception is easier to control. A man who doubts his instincts will second-guess his pain. A man who fears abandonment will swallow anything to avoid it. She knew this. She used this. And now you're done. Not because she changed, but because you finally accepted she won't. This is not bitterness, it is maturity. Maturity is seeing what's in front of you, not what you wish was there. She loved the power, not the man. And the man no longer confuses silence with love. He lets it speak for itself and walks. You weren't addicted to her. You were addicted to who you became when she smiled. There was something sacred in those moments of approval. The way she looked at you when she decided you were worthy, brief, rare, intoxicating. You craved that feeling like a drug, because it wasn't just attention. It was confirmation that your pain had finally purchased connection. But that was the illusion. You were never seen. You were scanned, measured, assessed for vulnerability. And once your pattern was known, she fed you just enough validation to keep you obedient. This is not love. This is behavioral conditioning. And now that you see it, you feel ashamed. Not because you loved, but because you let yourself be trained. You mistook obedience for devotion. You thought endurance was virtue. You believed that staying through manipulation made you loyal. But all it did was teach her that your pain had a price and she could afford it. You are not a martyr. You are a man who forgot he was enough. Enough without earning. Enough without bleeding. Enough without being needed. The will wants you to forget that. It whispers that you are alone now because you failed. That if you had stayed quiet just a little longer, she would have come around. That if you had sacrificed just one more part of yourself, she would have finally loved you. But the will lies, because its survival depends on your silence. And your silence is over. You will no longer plead to be understood by those who feed on your confusion. You will no longer hand your heart to those who see it as a throne. She loved the power, not the man. And the man has stopped mistaking longing for proof of love. He sits with the ache and does not chase it away. You didn't fall for her. You fell for the reflection she offered until she shattered it. In the beginning, she made you feel heroic, like you had purpose, like you were chosen. But that image had nothing to do with you. It was her fantasy, and you were just playing the lead. When the role no longer served her script, she rewrote the ending and blamed you for not fitting the part. This is what power does. It doesn't just consume, it rewrites. She became cold and called it boundaries. She became unavailable and called it self-respect. She broke connection and said it was your fault for needing too much. But you didn't need too much. You just finally asked for something real, something mutual, and real love cannot survive inside a performance. She left not because of your need, but because of your awakening. Because once you began to see her clearly, she could no longer play the role she loved most, the unreachable. She needed distance to maintain control. Closeness would have required accountability, and the will resists accountability like a flame resists water. You were too alive, too alert, too present, and presence threatens power because power relies on distortion, Now you are clear, and in that clarity you feel alone. But this loneliness is not the punishment. It is the purification. You are burning off the remnants of performance. She is not your enemy. She is your lesson. She showed you what happens when love becomes a mirror for someone else's vanity, and you finally refuse to disappear inside it. She loved the power, not the man, and the man no longer plays the role written for his erasure.